Growing up, my life took a sudden and disorienting turn when I was around 9 years old. My parents, who had always seemed to get along, shocked me with the announcement of their divorce. Unlike the tumultuous separations I'd heard about from friends, theirs was unexpectedly calm and straightforward. They revealed that they had found new partners. My mom decided to move out with her new boyfriend, while my dad's new partner moved in with us. They planned for me to split my time between them since they would be living just 3 miles apart. Despite their promises of new gadgets, vacations, and all the things they thought could make me happy, I felt a deep sense of loss. All I truly wanted was to have my family together under one roof. Watching my mom pack up and leave, and my dad's partner take over our home, was heartbreaking. Things grew more complicated over time. My stepmom's twin boys, around my age, clearly didn't care for me, mirroring my feelings toward them. At my mom's new home, I felt increasingly unwelcome as she started a new family with her boyfriend, which left me feeling like an outsider. I eventually found solace living with my aunt, my father's sister, and my godmother, who became a stable presence in my life. This arrangement lasted until I turned 19, when life threw another curveball my way. I inherited $200 million from my grandfather. This sudden windfall brought my estranged parents back into my life, not out of concern, but with demands for financial help for my half-siblings and to cover my father's debts. Feeling manipulated and used, I was faced with a dilemma about how to handle these sudden demands from family members who had previously shown little interest in my well-being. As I navigated these complex family dynamics, I had to learn to prioritize my own emotional and financial health above the pressures and expectations of those who had once abandoned me. After a year of shuttling between my separated parents' homes, I finally settled in with my aunt permanently. Initially, I had been bouncing between their houses without them realizing my final decision. It took my parents over 2 months to notice that I wasn't just visiting, but had moved in with my aunt. My mother assumed I was with my father, and vice versa, highlighting their lack of involvement in my life as they were preoccupied with their new families. Living with my aunt was a breath of fresh air. She filled the void of parental affection with simple acts of love, taking me out for dinner, movies, and even on vacations during the summer to visit my grandfather's farm. These moments with her brought a genuine sense of belonging and happiness that I hadn't felt in a while. Initially, my dad would send a monthly allowance to support me, but over time, even that became inconsistent. My aunt sometimes nudged him to remind him, but often she let it go. Not wanting to burden her further, I started working in her plant nursery after school and helped with household chores like taking out the trash and running errands. Despite the care and support from my aunt, it became painfully clear that my parents had drifted too far from their roles. They routinely forgot my birthdays, only making a perfunctory call when my aunt reminded them. They never visited, not even for significant milestones like my high school graduation. My aunt was the only one there for me. When confronted by my aunt about their neglect, they would briefly apologize, but their remorse was short-lived. Over time, I grew increasingly resentful of their absenteeism and empty apologies. Eventually, I stopped answering their calls, leading to accusations from them that I was being rude. I stood my ground, unwilling to let their blame games affect my resolve to live independently of their emotional neglect. I continued my journey, moving to university and living on my own, though I always made it a point to visit my aunt during birthdays and holidays. Her unconditional support over the years meant the world to me, and I wanted to ensure she knew her efforts were deeply appreciated. Recently, my grandfather on my father's side passed away. His death marked another chapter in my life, reminding me of the complex family dynamics I've navigated through these years. As I approach the completion of my university studies, I reflect on these experiences, recognizing the profound impact of genuine care versus the absence of it. The loss of my grandfather was a deeply sorrowful time for both my aunt and me. We had been the closest to him, in stark contrast to my father and uncles who seldom visited. Yet, they all appeared promptly at his funeral and were keenly present at the reading of his will. To their dismay, my grandfather had bequeathed all his assets, including a 197-acre farmland, the farmhouse, and $200 million in cash to my aunt. He donated the remainder of his wealth to charity. This decision may seem harsh, but it was justified given their prolonged absence during his illness. My aunt had been his constant companion during his last days while I was away at university. After inheriting the property and cash, my aunt called me home her house, which I consider my true home. There, she told me she would give me the $200 million that Grandpa had left. I was overwhelmed with emotion, not just because of the money, but because it affirmed how much she truly cared for me. Over the years, I had often shared my dream of starting my own business with her, and now she was funding that dream. I hugged her, tears streaming down my face, grateful for her unending support. News of the inheritance quickly reached my parents, and suddenly, their attitude towards me shifted. They began to shower me with attention and profess their unconditional love, frequently calling to check up on me. But I saw through their sudden change of heart it was clear they were motivated by the money. Last week, my dad even showed up at my university dorm, which he only knew through my aunt. He tried to reconnect, claiming pride in my upcoming graduation, and suggesting a family dinner as if nothing had happened. I confronted him about their long absence and lack of genuine contact, which left him speechless. Despite his attempts to reconcile, citing that he and my mom missed me and were sorry, I couldn't move past the resentment. Their presence was linked to their interest in the inheritance, not out of any real love or concern for me. My mom also left a voicemail, excited about my impending graduation and hinting at an invitation. She mentioned how proud they were that I was fulfilling their dream of attending university. Despite her enthusiasm, the thought of having them at my graduation felt undeserved and unwelcome. I confided in my aunt about my dilemma. While she suggested that reconciliation might be possible, she left the decision up to me. Now, I'm torn. I appreciate my aunt's guidance and understand the potential value of mending familial ties, but the hurt and disappointment from my parents' previous actions weigh heavily on me. I'm unsure if I can or even want to let them back into my life for such a significant occasion. Life has been hectic. But I have some good news. I've graduated from university and landed a job. Thank you all for your support. Now, let me address some of the common questions I've received. Many of you have asked about my aunt and how she was able to take me in for so many years. To clarify, my aunt is about 10 years older than my dad. When I moved in with her, she was in her late 47s and had been single for many years. Her husband passed away in an accident when I was just a baby, maybe 2 or 3 years old. She has a daughter who left home as a teenager to attend medical school and is now an interventional cardiologist living in the US. Since then, my aunt has lived alone. Although my cousin and I tried to encourage her to date again, she refused, saying she found happiness in caring for her plants. Some of you mentioned that I may have been too harsh on my parents, pointing out that they have every right to separate and find new partners. I agree they do have the freedom to make their own choices. However, I believe it's never acceptable to neglect your children once you start a new family, which is exactly what my parents did. When my parents first separated, the plan was for me to spend 1 week with each of them. However, they often acted like having me around was a burden. They would plan activities, like going out for dinner, only after I had left. It was painful to hear them say things like, "Oh, she's here now, so we'll go out next week," as if my presence was an inconvenience. My mom moved in with her boyfriend shortly after their separation and soon got pregnant. Their public displays of affection were uncomfortable for me, especially since I was still just a child. Once, they took me on a 3-day trip, but instead of spending time together, they left me alone in the room while they went sunbathing. Even when they were in the room, they would ask me to sit on the balcony outside. Although I was only 9, I knew what was happening and could even hear them inside. It was incredibly difficult to cope with, especially since the man she was with wasn't even my father. After a particularly disheartening trip with my mom, I decided to stop visiting her. My dad was somewhat better. At least he tried to include me sometimes. However, his stepsons would often throw tantrums about my presence, causing him to postpone our activities. He'd say, "Let's skip this one. Maybe next week father and son could go fishing," but that next week would never arrive. By then, I'd be back at my mom's house. It didn't take long for me to notice a pattern. My parents seemed to have an unspoken agreement to pass me back and forth, always promising, "Let's do it next week," whenever it was convenient for them to be rid of me. The few times I did join my dad and his new family on vacation were miserable. On the first day out, his wife and her sons would monopolize his attention, leaving me feeling utterly ignored. Even during family photo sessions, they asked me to take the pictures, ensuring I was in none of them. Out of all the photos from that trip, only 4 included one of me alone, and just 1 with my dad. This context might help those who thought I was too harsh on my parents understand my perspective better. Now, concerning recent events, My parents claimed they wanted to reconnect because they were proud of my university graduation and wanted to celebrate with me. However, considering their absence during my high school graduation, consumed by their new families, I was skeptical. They insisted on attending, but I didn't extend an invitation. I did, however, get extra tickets in case they decided to show up uninvited. They didn't. I made sure the graduation ceremony's date was kept from them, and they completely forgot about it. It's been nearly a month since I graduated, and not once have they reached out to confirm the dates. It's clear that their sudden interest was merely a pretext to re-enter my life. Here's the latest update, almost 3.1 months post-graduation. My mom called to inform me that my half-sister Ellie had graduated from primary school and was now enrolled in a private elementary school. But they were facing a shortage of funds and wanted me. I was completely taken aback when my mom called out of the blue, asking me to fund Ellie's education. She bluntly stated that since my aunt had left me a $200 million inheritance, I should step up as a big brother. "Your sister needs you now," she insisted, but I halted her immediately. "Hold on, this is delusional. I've never even met this sister you're talking about. Where were you when I needed my mom?" When I was sick and alone, her response was just tears, and she accused me of living in the past. She tried to guilt trip me by saying, "You have this huge sum of money. What better use could there be than your sister's education?" I wanted to say more, but I restrained myself and simply told her, "I have plans for that money, and I can't spare any for anyone else." She ended the call abruptly and didn't even ask about my graduation day. It was clear to me then that their sudden interest was purely financial. Just when I thought I'd heard it all, I received a call from a bank about a defaulted mortgage that my dad was responsible for. They had gotten my number from him. My dad had taken out a personal loan and had fallen behind on payments. When the collectors pursued him, he suggested they contact me. Initially, I panicked, unsure of my legal responsibilities. Instead of confronting my dad, I reached out to a friend who was finishing up law school. Though not yet a lawyer, he was knowledgeable about legal matters. He reassured me that I was under no legal obligation to pay my dad's debts. The bank's recovery agent had contacted me because they could ask anyone they thought might pay, but I had every right to refuse. When the bank called again, their recovery agent used a very assertive tone, trying to intimidate me into paying. This time, I was prepared and confronted them boldly. "Who gave you the right to speak to me like this? I'm not responsible for this debt. Contact the person who is." They apologized and hung up. A couple of hours later, my dad's wife called, shouting at me. I can't bring myself to call her my mom or even stepmom. She was furious that I had refused to cover the debt, but I stood my ground. I had learned that I needed to protect my boundaries and financial security, regardless of the pressures they tried to put on me. When the debt recovery officers got aggressive with my dad, demanding he pay the mortgage or face severe consequences, I was pulled into the drama. My dad's wife called me in a fury, accusing me of being heartless. "Your father is struggling to pay the mortgage, and you just turn away, even though you have the means to help," she yelled over the phone. I replied coldly, "I have no obligation to help because he never prioritized me. He always chose you and your boys over me. Why don't you all help him out?" She ended the call abruptly after that. That same night, my dad called me. He was drunk and emotional, not angry, but full of apologies. He admitted he hadn't treated me right, especially in front of his stepsons, and expressed deep regret for his past actions. He seemed to genuinely understand his mistakes and wanted to make amends. Despite his remorse, I told him I didn't want to dredge up the past, nor did I want them back in my life. He pleaded for my forgiveness, but I explained that apologies and remorse couldn't undo the years of neglect. I've learned to live without their influence, and I preferred to keep it that way. After hanging up, I couldn't help but wonder if denying him financial help was the right decision. I felt a pang of guilt knowing he was being pursued by the bank. Part of me even suspected that this plea for help might be another tactic to emotionally manipulate me into giving money. If he had asked directly, I would have refused, just as I did with my mom. What do you guys think? Should I have helped with a few months of his mortgage payments? Some of you suggested that it wouldn't have been too much of a burden for me to cover his mortgage for a couple of months. I considered this, feeling somewhat remorseful, and was on the verge of calling my dad to find out how much he needed. But before I could make that call, I received an email from my mom. She apologized for missing my graduation and invited me to a dinner with her and my dad, promising a return to the old times. just the four of us. Although I wasn't enthusiastic about revisiting memories of our past family life, I accepted the invitation. I wanted to put an end to this ongoing saga. At dinner, they repeated the same sentiments my dad had shared on the phone: apologies, expressions of remorse, and talks of forgiveness, all hoping to mend our relationship. During dinner, the atmosphere felt charged with unspoken intentions until, out of nowhere, my mom asked, "Baby, we were wondering what plans you have for your inheritance money?" She quickly added, "No, I mean your dad and I could offer you some good investment advice. You're pretty young to handle such decisions on your own." I responded nonchalantly, "Thanks, but I've already got someone advising me on that, so I'm good." The table fell silent for the next few minutes. Then, my mom tried a different angle. Your dad has been having a hard time because he defaulted on the mortgage," she ventured. "I know," I replied, turning to my dad. "But why did you take that personal loan? Was it for business?" He looked down ashamed and muttered, "It was for his son's college tuition." Before I could process that, my mom interjected, "It doesn't matter what it was for. The point is your dad's in trouble, and we need to help him. Why don't you clear his mortgage and his stepson can pay you back when he gets a job? And the rest of the money, you could give it to me. Remember, your Ellie needs to go to a private school. She'll pay you back when she's older and earning." Feeling the absurdity of the conversation peaking, I replied, "How about we just eat our dinner silently and call it a night?" That sarcastic comeback did not sit well with her. She lost her temper and yelled, accusing me of still being that self-centered brat who only cared about himself. I retorted, "Yes, that's who I am." I was ready to end this charade. I could have lectured them about their selfish behavior, especially since they knew I had my own student loans to pay off. Yet here they were, expecting me to finance my stepbrother's education and Ellie's private schooling, while also managing my own debts. "I'm done with you guys," I declared firmly. "It's clear you only wanted me back in your lives for the money. And you know what? You can forget about it because you're not getting a penny from me." I stood up from the table, leaving enough cash to cover my portion of the dinner bill, and walked out without looking back.